Step into the light, I'm alive, I can see your love shining. You put it on the inside, so no matter where the darkness, you were shining like lightning. I surrender, you fight my fight. Darkness ain't ever gonna take my life. I'm so I give you my praise, that's right. I'm so I give you my praise, that's right. I'm so I give you my praise, that's right. I'm so I give you my praise, that's right. God, I know this really is about give and take. I mean, let go of the fear that lay into me. God, I know they gave my life, I gotta give it away. Oh, don't let me fall. Please don't let me.
As the Roman Empire was disintegrating, Christian orthodoxy was being challenged. The belief that human nature is inclined to goodness and that man possesses free will came under assault. The stage was set for the fight of the century. In one corner, we have the monk Pelagius, a man now famous for his defense of free will. And in the other corner, we have Augustine of Hippo, a bishop schooled in rhetoric and anxious to shift Christian orthodoxy towards his view of determinism and original sin. The pages of many history books tell us that Pelagius lost that fight, was excommunicated, and those beliefs that Augustine asserted Pelagius held were condemned as heresy. But who is this man, Pelagius? What did he really believe, and how did this event, this conflict between himself and Augustine, shape Christian doctrine? Well, hello and welcome to Idol Killer, a ministry dedicated to destroying sacred cows for the cause of Christ. I'm your host, Warren McGrew, and today we are honored to have with us Dr. Ali Bonner. Now, after reading classics at Oxford, Dr. Bonner studied Anglo Saxon, Norse, and Celtic in Cambridge, where she gained a BA and a master's in philosophy, followed by a PhD on the manuscript transmission of Pelagius's letter to Demetrias. Subsequently, she was a British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at Jesus College in Oxford before being appointed to the Lectureship in Celtic History at Cambridge. Dr. Bonner, thank you so much. Welcome to the show. It's an honor and a privilege and a joy to have you with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, Warren.
We have had so many requests for this interview. I read through your book, I referenced it, and people said, you have to bring her on the show. And I said, I will do my best. And I really wasn't sure this was going to happen. And here we are. And so I'm really looking forward to it. And I know a lot of our viewers are as well. What was it about Pelagius? I mean, of all the things in history, and like the old saying, in all the places in all the world, you happen into this cantina. Well, what was it about Pelagius that drew your attention and led you to study his works?
Initially, it is that my interest is what was happening in the transition between the Roman Empire and what followed it in Britain and Ireland, and indeed in Europe. So it's a historical interest in what happened. Now, if you're interested in what happened in Britain and Ireland, particularly Britain in, say, the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, particularly the 5th century, there's a terrible dearth of any information, of any source texts, of any knowledge of what's happening there, and particularly of texts that were created in Britain. So I looked at the one person we knew had lived throughout the 5th century, and he was a Briton who went down to southern Gaul, southern France as it now is. He was called Faustus of Riez, and he lived throughout the 5th century, and he wrote, and we have his writings that survive. We have letters of his, but sadly only deeply theological letters to other people in southern Gaul, not anything that tells us about what's going on in Britain. But Faustus of Riez was accused of being what's been called a semi-Pelagian. Mm. And so he was this figure. I studied him and thought there's something wrong with the paradigm here, but I really couldn't put my finger on it. It was generally acknowledged that semi-Pelagianism was a term invented much later, but of course it led me to look at the term Pelagianism. And then historically, of course, the other figure who's alive at this time, who is a Briton, the first writer whose writings survive from Britain, is Pelagius. So it was fundamentally a historical interest in what was going on in Britain. However, once you look at the texts, I also had studied classics, and I was very interested in the transition between the classical world and the early medieval world, because that's what I've looked at both. And once you read Pelagius' writings, you realise he is a pivotal and an important figure. And also, Warren, he's very engaging. You see, I didn't come to his letters naturally sympathetic, but he does get inside your head. He has a tone that is approachable. He somehow speaks, and even in translation, he's a good writer. He's persuasive, and you feel like he's talking to you, even if some of the things he's saying are very alien to your way of life, or not modern at all. And some of them we definitely wouldn't sympathise with. So it was a historical interest, really. These were the two, particularly Pelagius. He's writing in the 5th century. He's really he's the only person we know. But then subsequently, it has a huge impact on the history of Britain and Ireland, and indeed on the continent as well. But you can see that this subject, is features in most of the texts that survive from the 5th, 6th, 7th century in Britain. So it's really important to understand the debate, and it has serious political consequences in Britain and Ireland.
So it wasn't as though you were coming in with an axe to grind, as it were, and you're saying, I have a position I'm going to impose on the historical data. It was more of just a fascination to really understand what was being conveyed and believed in the world at that time.
Yes, thank you for raising that, Warren, because it's really important. I don't myself. I know it's really difficult for everyone. Most people have a view on this. Somehow deep down, they have a view. I have a view tangentially about the upshot of all of this and whether or not it was right that it was legislated on. But actually, theologically, I'm not about saying what's the right view theologically. That's not what I'm about, because I can see both sides, in the sense that I can understand somebody who says, no, I physically feel that grace does inspire me every single time, and without it, I wouldn't. You see, I can understand people's views. So I'm not trying to say which view is right. I'm interested in how these texts tell us about what's going on culturally at the time. And in the broader picture, that is something that history in universities as an academic discipline has taken what's been called a cultural turn. So it's moved away from just looking at battles and politics and straight military and political events, and turned more towards culture, social issues, gender issues, all sorts of cultural aspects. And that's why it's started to look at religious texts, because very often concepts of justice are expressed through writing about religion, because God is, for most people, he's the ultimate form of justice. And so their conception of God expresses their sense of justice. And some great scholarship. Karen King has written about some early Christian texts and really shown how they express that they're having an argument, there's a heresy accusation going on, and really it's about what justice is. And it's actually about political circumstances at the time and what those should be and what they are. And so, but it's expressed through the vehicle of religious text. So you can see that, generally speaking, historians have taken this cultural turn, and they're starting to look at religious texts. So that explains how someone who's interested in history would turn to theological texts.
And this is within the realm of religion, specifically Christian religion. This is one of those topics that people tend to become very impassioned around, and objectivity is often lacking. And so I thoroughly, I thoroughly endorse your book, picked it up, and was really delighted to study it, because I found that it was really just a objective analysis of the historical data, and it presented some information there that wasn't aware of previously. And I think in Christian debate, objectivity is often lacking, unfortunately. It is, I'm going to defend my position, and really not really considering, well, we may even disagree with the other side, but why did he believe what he believed? And what was there any merit, or can you understand? And empathy even is sometimes a struggle. But who was this monk Pelagius, and what was his history leading up to his confrontation with Augustine?
Well, he wasn't initially a monk. Initially, he's a lay preacher. So around about 18, we think he goes to Rome to study law. So that tells us he's from an affluent background in Britain. If you go to study law in Rome, it was that the later stages, you've gone through your grammarian, your grammaticus teaching up to 18 or 19, and then you would go and study. And the acme was the apex was to go to Rome. It's a very expensive thing to do. And we know from Augustine that the top 10% were creamed off into the imperial administration. So it was monitored, the teaching at Rome. And the idea was, we know from Augustine's Confessions that not just his parents would pay for this, his father would pay for it, but actually local people within the area would contribute, because the idea is you study law, you get in the top 10%, you go into the imperial bureaucracy, and then of course you hope to get on the ladder to become a provincial governor back home. And of course then that's why family friends of Augustine's father would invest in Augustine's education, because there'll be a payback. There'll be a comeback if he gets to being appointed to be an administrator. So we can see that career cycle is happening and is alive, and that's why people from the provinces will pay for their son to go to Rome and to have that final, what we call sort of university type education, in the hope that they'd get into the imperial bureaucracy and eventually make their way up to a senior position. So he went to study law in Rome. We don't know what happened, but it looks like he stopped studying law, and what we next see is that he's writing a commentary on the Pauline epistles. So he's clearly taken to studying Christianity, and from his letters we can see that he is explaining Christianity to lay people. So he's becoming an expert. Now, my view is that there's a whole series of people. He's way not the first to be doing this. It's a career move. You become expert in Christianity, and the main way to do that is to study the Greek fathers, and particularly for a Latin audience who are not able to read the Greek. Of course, lots of them could perhaps, but many wouldn't have been able to read the Greek fathers. There are people who are translating them, and they're building a career doing that. And we can name Rufinus of Aquileia. We can say John Cassian does that later. Jerome is a classic example of someone who made his career by being a fantastic linguist and essentially translating, reworking, bringing the Christianity of the Greek fathers, who were so revered, to the Latin West. So my view is that Pelagius, I think there's clear evidence that he could read Greek, and he's just another one of these. And so that's a career. It is a career move. You can earn a living. We know from Jerome in one of his letters says, he's writing to an aristocrat in Rome. He says, I don't know why you're funding these people. So we know that just as they had philosophers within an elite, noble, aristocratic house in Rome, they would have within their household experts, and those would have been in philosophy earlier, but now they're becoming in Christian ethics and Christian scripture, essentially experts in scripture, because it's not, Warren, it's, as you say, it's not easy to understand scripture. It would need to be explained, and clearly people could make a career at this. Jerome gives us in his letters insights into people who are accused of doing so in a slightly dishonest way. So priests who are going around old ladies clearing up legacies and those dubious behavior. But there are also people who are genuinely studying Christianity. We can also see that there's just a sheer number of Latin commentaries on the Pauline epistles that appear one after another in this period, tell us that there is an interest, a real interest to understand parts of the Bible, particularly perhaps the New Testament, but all of it. And people can build careers on that. Now, Jerome hoped to go on to become a bishop, and he didn't, and he felt that was a wrong thing that had happened to him, and he'd had to leave Rome under a cloud because one of the families he was teaching, a daughter had died, and that was put at the feet of Jerome. Or he tells us that was somehow he was felt to have caused that. So he had to leave, and he didn't get his bishopric, despite the fact that he'd been working for the Pope and advising the Pope. But that wasn't, you didn't have to become a bishop or go into the priesthood. You could just carry on as a lay preacher. So we think that's what Pelagius was doing. Subsequently, when he went to the Holy Land in advance of Rome being sacked, so barbarian armies are camped outside Rome, there's a mass exodus. Pelagius leaves along with many other people, and via Carthage, via North Africa, he makes his way to the Holy Land. That's where in the trial transcripts, we can see that he's for the first time referred to as a monk. And in one of his earlier letters, he says, I don't call people who live within I think the term monk, it's monachos in Greek, only belongs to people who live in retreat, in withdrawn communities. I don't call myself that because I live in the city. I'm in an urban environment. So I think he started off as a lay preacher, and he did actually end up as a monk, but only by the time he'd got to Palestine, to the Holy Land.
Interesting, very interesting. And before his confrontation with Augustine, and you'd brought this up regarding Jerome, but I believe Pelagius and Jerome had a bit of a scuffle before Pelagius and Augustine came into contact. Is that correct?
It's possible. We don't know for certain because we have Jerome's writings, and he says that Jerome actually got into trouble with people in Rome on several issues for taking somewhat extreme views. So he'd gotten involved in a couple of controversies earlier, and it's possible that someone he refers to may have been Pelagius, who may have said that advocating, so there was debate going on about whether or not you had to be chaste, whether or not you could be married, whether it was more valuable, whether a married Christian could be just as good a Christian as someone who kept themselves chaste. So whether virginity was really key to getting into heaven, to salvation.
And that was more of Jerome's position, was it? Not?
Yeah, he'd taken a very strong view on this, and it seemed to denigrate marriage, and that was the key point, that marriage is a sacrament blessed by God, created by God, and therefore that's what he was accused of having taken too radical a position and stated it in too extreme a form. And you can see later on, people are very careful to say that this is a council of greater perfection. It's not enjoined on everyone. So they make a careful distinction later, and that's the fallout from that controversy about just overstating the case for virginity.
Got it. And now, in your book, the myth of Pelagianism, you detail that Pelagius had views on man's innate goodness, his achievability of goodness by means of willing. Was this a novel view, or to what degree was this viewed held by his peers and forebears?
It wasn't novel at all, and that's where it really, really is not novel. Once you've looked at, I looked particularly at Jerome, who throughout his career up until around 414 had explicitly stated the effective free will or dual free will. So everyone agreed you had free will to evil. Nobody thought there was no debate about that. Augustine thought that too. The question was whether you had any free will to virtue, whether you contributed to it. So no, he didn't say anything new. If you read, I looked at Athanasius's Life of Anthony and the Latin translations of it. Particularly influential is Evagrius of Antioch's Latin translation of it. I looked at Jerome, and there is not a single thing. There is no vocabulary. There's no development of ideas. There is nothing that Pelagius wrote that is in any way original. And if you look at Basil of Caesarea, and Rufinus of Aquileia is a Latin author who spent a lot of time in the Holy Land, but then comes back to Aquileia in northeast Italy. By 397, he has translated Basil's rule into Latin. So that's before Pelagius even began to write, because we think his commentaries around 404 onwards came out then. So these are all way, way before. This is 30 or 40 years before Pelagius is writing, that Evagrius of Antioch, Jerome, they're using the same ideas in the same terminology.
Well, we also have the work of the Didache, which would present two roads or two ways that people could choose. And so it seems there's an ability for man to choose the road to life and the road to death, which again seems to indicate that this idea of free will was widespread and affirmed well before Pelagius' time, because I believe what is it modern scholarship is saying that it could have existed as early as 90 AD, according to the sources that I was looking at for the Didache. One of the things too that you pointed out was, and this is what really was extremely helpful for me in understanding what is Pelagianism as expressed by Augustine versus as it's referred to today for various rhetoric purposes. And you'd listed 14 particular points within Augustine's articulation of Pelagianism, such as that the wealthy were, according to Augustine's articulation of this, the wealthy were not true Christians. They wouldn't inherit the kingdom of God because they didn't renounce their wealth. And looking at it from a critical standpoint, one could see that perhaps there was a benefit in getting the wealthy, the affluent, and the powerful on your side to attack an opponent. But considering the surviving works of Pelagius, do these charges hold up to scrutiny?
Well, I argued not. So I argued that 7 of them are flatly contradicted. And I also argued, if they're not true, why are they being created? But that's a whole nother subject. So no, the straight answer to you is not half of one tenet in the 14 that Augustine lists. The accusations against Pelagius changed over time, and they also varied. But if we take the 14 on the deed to Pelagius, De Gestis Pelagii, that you're talking about, half of one of them is something he actually taught, and that is that the grace is given in accord with merit. Not always, but sometimes. And that is explicitly stated by Evagrius of Antioch in his translation, by Jerome, by Basil, by Athanasius. It's there all. So that was not something it was something Pelagius taught, but it was not something that he originated. It was absolutely commonplace. If you're talking about the accusation of that you can be perfect, when you look at other writers at the time, when you look at the mass of ascetic writing, this is the golden era of patristics. So many people are writing very fervently. They're very inspired to write by Christianity, and they're very persuasive. So there's a lot of literature being produced. Talking about perfection was common in ascetic paranesis. So paranesis meaning encouragement, exhortation, advice. It's absolutely common. Jerome slipped into language accidentally. He starts to talk about it as if it is actually achievable. Other people, but when you look at the Greek text, they're talking about it is often simply they mean this is the aim of perfection, but some of them do. Palladius of Helenopolis does talk about it. He says ex-monk has become perfect, has achieved perfection. So some of these ideas were in circulation around the Mediterranean. They are in ascetic literature. The one about the wealthy getting into heaven, we have a letter from Hilary, a layman in Sicily, who writes to Augustine, and we have Augustine's letter about the letter back. And it's clear that some people on Sicily are saying that the rich can't get into heaven. That's the simple version of it. Now, quite a few people, Basil of Caesarea, when there was famine in 367, I think it's 367 in Asia Minor, gave sermons. It really changed him, and he later on he built his basilead. He built a community with a hospital facility. He was very socially concerned. But I think because of this famine, he writes a sermon in which he comes to say that the rich not giving to the poor, I think we can understand in time of famine, is a form of theft. Now, the next generation, Chrysostom, goes on and actually says the rich not giving to the poor is a form of theft. And in fact, there was a French editor of the Greek version of Basil's sermon who was so concerned by what Basil was saying. He saw it as socialism, and he said, I have to reassure you, this is not the view of the Catholic Church on property redistribution. So these ideas were around. We know that someone, preachers had been saying it. The flaw in this is that one of the few ascetic propaganda, what I call ascetic propagandists, but writers of ascetic paranesis is what I mean, one of the few who didn't say that. In fact, pretty much one of the only ones who didn't say it was Pelagius. But you can see that those ideas are around. And of course, if you're trying to, well, of course, my theory is that this is the invention of heresy in order to relocate orthodoxy. But if you're trying to create a figure to alarm people, a figure who is dangerous and worrying as a straw man, as an opposite, as a binary, so that you can pit yourself against that, then you would pick up any ideas that were problematical and you'd bundle them together and you'd put them at Pelagius's feet. Now, for example, that letter from to the layman on Sicily, Augustine says in it, I think it might be Caelestius who's in Sicily, who's somehow at the bottom of all of this. He's preaching. But what he actually says is it's not certain. Maybe it is, but he has no evidence to go on. He's just throws it into the letter, the suggestion that this might be the case. But that letter gets taken to the east, to the Holy Land, and is presented in a trial of Pelagius as fact that it was Caelestius. But that's not what the letter actually says. The letter actually says, was Caelestius? He's not sure if it was, but it then gets translated as Augustine says it's a fact Caelestius was behind all this stuff going on in Sicily. But Jerome tells us that idea about the rich not getting into heaven was in circulation on many of the islands in the Mediterranean. He actually says it's going around the islands in the Mediterranean. I don't think Caelestius can have been at the bottom. He can't have been on all the islands at the same time.
He was a very fast runner.
Yeah, clearly. So it's about constructing. It's about a construct. It's about having something that is clearly objectionable, problematic, or objectionable, and then at the same time with the 14 tenets, by saying these things are obviously heresy, you are assuming that the contrary, that original sin, an absolutist account of prevenient grace, and predestination interpreted as preordainment are acknowledged orthodoxy. Actually, this is a debate about what should be acknowledged orthodoxy, but it's a good tactic. If you're getting someone condemned, and a sociologist like Howard Becker points out, you need to get someone condemned. If you want to create new laws, you need to raise alarm, you need to scare people, you need to have a dangerous something to get them together to legislate, to activate them to actually legislate against this thing. It's most convenient if it's a mythical villain, because then there's nobody to answer back. So we can see why creating this construction in order to silently or in order to import new ideas is what's going on. So that's why, no, Pelagius didn't teach the 14 tenets. One half of one of them he did teach, and that's not new.
So one of the things that I started saying after reading the book was that Pelagius was the first semi-Pelagian, because he was roughly 1/28 Pelagian according to those 14 points.
Yeah.
Now, Augustine had made this case that Pelagianism was this vast, growing movement, this looming threat, but it was more of a hodgepodge of various ideas that were perhaps on the periphery, or even I think one of the things you had mentioned in your book was how it was Augustine would take something that had been said, draw an inference, and then extend that into yet another inference so far removed from the statement as to create a villain that really in no way resembled the original thing being quoted. But there wasn't this vast Pelagianism sort of movement that the church needed to battle. It was more of an aim to recenter orthodoxy.
Yeah, I think that that's a key point, Warren. There is no, when you look at what are supposed to be the defining tenets of this thing, Pelagianism, which I say didn't exist, but when you look at the defining tenets, there's no agreement. In the texts that we do have that survive, they simply disagree on things that are supposed to be the defining elements of it. So there is one text by someone called Rufinus, the Syrian, who did say Adam was born mortal and would have died whether or not he'd sinned. That's one text. That's one of the ones that's flatly contradicted by Pelagius, and no one else we know said that. But so no one else says that. Then there are other ideas about, is virginity, is chastity required to be a good Christian? There's no agreement on that. So when you go through the few defining tenets, there's just no agreement. And Pelagius certainly doesn't adhere to most of them. So it's, but this again, this is a process when you're trying to create an accusation of heresy. People get lumped together who don't actually agree, and because a movement is scary, because if it's organized, it's scary. That's part of the process. There were ideas, there were ideas circulating around the Mediterranean. People, this is an era when, in order to prove your status, your educational status, you write. So people are writing about Christianity, and they're very free. They are very free, and you can see Augustine being frustrated. And of course, it was frustrating that people could write whatever they liked, and they could pass things off as being his. They could put anybody's name on them. Of course, it was frustrating, and he didn't like that because, of course, it led to some ideas that could be unfortunate or unhelpful. So yes, there's no unity, and there was no movement. And essentially also the problem that leads to is when scholars are one of the things I looked at when I first started was I went and looked at manuscripts, and I sat for 6 weeks in the University Library in Cambridge and just looked at the content, manuscript catalogues. And what you realise, Michael Lappage is a great scholar of Anglo Saxon history and Anglo Saxon libraries, and he pointed out that what people don't often realise until they look at manuscripts is that the vast bulk of the texts that are in medieval libraries are anonymous. They're anonymous or pseudonymous, so travelling under false names, but most of them are anonymous, which is a bit counterintuitive unless, when you first hear it, you think, surely they all have authorial names attributed, but they don't. They're mostly anonymous. So what I realised was how much of this material is out there. And of material that is promoting what Rowan Greer called this earlier version of Christianity. He said it's the 4th century mainstream Christianity, which is that human nature is inclined to goodness, and that there is some element of free will. The false idea that gets created in order to delegitimize it is that this is a binary opposition. It's an either-or choice. That was never the position of the Greek fathers. It was never Pelagius's position. So that's not, in creating the binary polarity, that's a fiction of the construct, but that's not what Pelagius teaches. And it's certainly not what Basil, or they all talk about cooperation. Indeed, that's the point of the life of Anthony, both in the Greek and the Latin versions, is the cooperation of God's grace with human endeavour. And John Cassian's Conference 13, that's what it's all about, is saying that it is a cooperative process. And it's clear from Pelagius' writings that that's what he says. He says at the last sentences of his statement of faith, it's I believe in free will. I think that there is free will in such a way that we always have need of God's grace. So this is really an argument about what grace is. It's about what is grace? How should we understand God's intervention in human life? And that's where the argument centers. But the 14 tenets distract you from that. They make it about something else. They make it about these people who are arrogant and say, we only need free will. And that's not what was being said.
Now, in your book, you mentioned, I believe, there were 7 or 9 different categories of uses for God's grace that the early church had used, but in Augustine's view, it really took on almost a monolithic, prevenient, effectual grace. Could you give us some examples of let's say, those other categories of grace that we don't have to go through all of them, but just a few?
No, absolutely. So essentially, gratia, interestingly, charis in the Greek is translated often as donum. It's either gratia, it's the straight translation, but in some of the translations of Athanasius's life, it's sometimes translated as donum, as gift in the Latin. So these are aspects of God's grace, is what I would say. And they talk about the grace of healing, the grace of wisdom, the grace of understanding. There are many different types of grace. There is the grace of salvation, there's the grace of creation. There are lots of different aspects of God's grace, of his gift. These are his many manifold generous gifts to mankind. So it might be the grace of nature, it might be the grace of creation. There are lots of different graces. So you're quite right. Absolutely, Warren. That's an important thing, that this is about how to define grace, and whether there is a prevenient grace is not, that is a thing that's absolutely in the Bible. But is it always and only solely prevenient grace that causes goodness? Is there just one sort of grace that matters? And Augustine etymologized it as deriving from gratis, meaning free, meaning you don't ever earn it. So when he said free, he meant it's never related to, there's no causal link between anything that we do and grace. It's always freely given. You can have a freely given grace that's given to humanity. There are other ways of keeping that freely given grace, but still saying, actually, it's free to humanity because none of us really deserve it. We all sin, and therefore it's freely given. So you don't have to have one narrow account of what gratia, what grace is. There are many different aspects of it, and in the Greek fathers, it's in the life of Anthony, it's there to prevent arrogance. The function of grace in the text is to show that this is always a cooperative endeavor, and you should never get proud of you should never think that you did it alone. You should always be grateful. So actually, ironically, the function, in my view, the function of grace is to forestall arrogance.
That's a fascinating point. Now, and I don't want to understate that, and I don't want to move on too quickly from that, but I know your time is limited, and so I'm going to get to our next question. But that is definitely a point that I will be listening to again when I replay this, and I'm sure many of we have Scott Heath here chiming in with an amen. Now, as I understand it, Pelagius was brought for the assembly in the Synod of Diospolis, and was actually declared orthodox and acquitted. That seems to be one of those facts of history that often gets obfuscated or dismissed, and they'll say, well, Pelagius and Pelagianism was declared a heresy, but it was before then. It was actually Pelagius being declared orthodox. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. He was actually acquitted 3 times.
Three times?
Yeah, there was a meeting in Jerusalem, and then the same year there was the Council of Diospolis, which was it was an episcopal synod, an episcopal trial, and then subsequently there was the trial at Rome, where he was not present, but it was a trial to which he sent a dossier of documents, and that's his statement of faith and his letter to Innocent. Now, what happened was, so Warren, these events, this chronology of events is hugely contested. There is literally nothing about the order of which letters went where and what was said in them and what was happening that is not contested. So this is an account of what was happening, but essentially the African bishops, there are letters that survive to Pope Innocent which are stating the case of the accusations made at Carthage against Caelestia. So they're saying there's these really dangerous, damaging new ideas that have been brought forward. They put them to Innocent, and Innocent writes back and says, yes, these ideas are awful. What I think happened is that Innocent, of course, then died. Innocent excommunicated Pelagius until such time as his case had been heard at Rome. Now, we don't have a document that proves that, but in my view, the fact Pelagius sent his defense documents meant that there must have been a letter from Innocent to Bishop John of Jerusalem, or to Pelagius, probably to Bishop John of Jerusalem, saying, right, this issue has been complained. The African bishops have brought this case against Pelagius. He needs to answer this case, and it will be heard in Rome. As it happens, Innocent died, and Zosimus, the next pope, heard that case, and that case was acquitted. And Zosimus's letters, Pelagius was acquitted, as was Caelestius. And Zosimus's letters to the African bishops, telling them that Pelagius and Caelestius had been acquitted at Rome, survive. And subsequently, there's another letter from Zosimus where he's hedging his bets, and you can see him very concerned. So something has happened between the trial 418, and then by June, something is going on. Zosimus reads like he's been pressured. He's had to change his position. He's now writing, he's rowing back on what he'd said. And we know that then subsequently in the summer of 418, he did issue an epistolar tract where he issues a letter, but it doesn't survive in full. Fragments of it survive, and people have reconstructed it according to the fragments. My own view is that that's slightly problematical process. Of course, it's valuable insofar as, but we don't have the actual letter of condemnation. We do have, what happened was on the 30th of April, there was a coordination between the African Church and the Imperial Court. And so on the 30th of April, the African Church issues, I think it's that way around, but one of them, the 30th of April, issues another set of condemnations as synodal actor. And then the Emperor Honorius issues a law banning Caelestis and Pelagius from Rome and condemning, actually he only talks about original sin. That's the only thing he convicts them of. And it's a very incomprehensible, it's a letter written in a very flowery style. So Pelagius was acquitted 3 times, but he then was subsequently condemned through lobbying, and there was not a 4th case. And so there was a decision, there were synodal acta issued from Africa, and there was Honorius's rescript, which is an imperial, the emperor's law that is issued.
Now, I'd heard that, or I'd read that it was believed to be pressure from Emperor Honorius to Pope Zosimus that led to that reversal. Is there any historical merit to that argument?
Well, we don't, honestly, Warren, we don't know, because there's no evidence. We just don't know. So basically, we don't know. What you have to, the only thing you can do is go to Zosimus's letters and look at the one where he clearly says he's acquitted them, and says, I mean, he says everyone's in tears, they were so moved, but I mean, you know, whether that's rhetorical exaggeration or whatever. But anyway, he says, so it's a very strong letter to the African bishops saying they've been acquitted, you have to accept this decision. And then there's the letter rowing back, and you simply have to read those and make up your mind, really. But,
okay.
And then you have to say, why is it an imperial rescript from Honorius? That's the thing that why is that what decides the fate of Pelagius? So we don't have enough information. There aren't enough texts.
We can draw inferences, but nothing to really validate beyond any doubt.
No.
With Augustine's condemnation of Pelagius, I've also read that he essentially broke the law to try him in absentia. That was against the basic due process, if you will, that was in place there. That for after these exonerations, Augustine took it upon himself to kind of be the presenter of the charges without anyone there to really defend Pelagius. Could you elaborate on that a little bit as well?
I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure what that's referring to, because the trial in absentia that Zosimus oversaw in Rome, that's absolutely legitimate. Not, you know, sending a defense dossier is absolutely fine. There's no problem with that. That is, Warren, that's up to your person. You know, that's up to your view as to whether you think it's legitimate or illegitimate. The person who really argued that was Julian of Eclanum. So he argued that there should have been a synod, that this should have been decided by an episcopal council in Italy. The flaw in that is that at that time, the barbarians were in, you know, that it was a chaotic political time. And the idea that they could have convened a synod, and that really, you know, people wouldn't have been able to travel. They wouldn't have been, it was not the time to be holding, in my view, that it was not a time when you could have held a synod. What we do know is there was no synod, but Julian thought that this should be decided. We might surmise that had they, I mean, Julian obviously thought if they'd met if the bishops of Italy, because he got 18 of them to sign his document saying that Pelagius's condemnation had not been due process, that there needed to be a synod, it needed to be discussed by bishops together. Julian clearly thought that it wouldn't have ended up with it. Clearly he thought this was a wrong decision. So he's a partisan view on that. But it was the case that you could argue that there should have been a case. It should have been a discussion. There should have been a synod. It should have been discussed, not necessarily with Pelagius there, but it should have been discussed by bishops much more openly. Someone else who put that forward is Vincent of Lerins. He did it tangentially. So he wrote a Commonitorum in the 430s in southern Gaul, in southern France now. And he talks about the meta issue of how you work out how do you know what right belief is? And he talks about antiquity and consent and what has always been agreed at ecumenical councils and what has always been believed by all and is proved from the Bible. So that points to the suggestion, because there's a subtext in what he's writing, that this is about a special form of grace that only some people are given. So he talks about that in his memorandum, is how we translate it really properly into English. So you can see that he's concerned about this issue, about how grace is defined. And his view is, and of course, his view is that all things should be decided by ecumenical councils. That sounds like he thinks this issue should have been decided by a council as well. So I don't think it's possible to say it was only Julian of Eclanum who thought that way. I think there was a general feeling. I think Vincent of Lerins shows that someone, at least one other person, thought that it would have been better. How do we determine? As Vincent said, there are as many interpretations of scripture as there are scriptural interpreters. And that's the problem he started from. And he said, in that situation, how do we determine what's right belief? What do we go on? And he thought it was antiquity and consent. And he thought it had to be by the fathers, by the congregations of bishops discussing it. Was that a realistic possibility when Julian called for it in 418?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It's not the in absentia problem. It's the whether or not it was actually fully openly discussed, and was Honorius the right person to be taking a decision on this?
Now, I've got a question here in the chat. I'm going to bring this up just real quickly here. It says the Council of Carthage condemned Pelagius as a heretic. What are the things that the council also condemned as heretical that are held by Calvin? Well, without going too deep into this, I believe infant baptism and some other things there were also put forward as orthodoxy and condemning that. Is there anything that you would like to speak to regarding the Council of Carthage on this matter?
Well, I'm not, as I said, Warren, I'm sorry to the viewer, I'm not an expert on later theology of Calvinism. I'm really not. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. So I'm not sure. I know what the arguments were at the time, but I think those are more about creating a false binary. And so I don't think those, it really depends on whether or not you think that whether you take, which parts of Augustine you take, because people have taken different views of Augustine. Some people have taken the parts of it that are more favor. I mean, Gottschalk of Ulbis in the Carolingian era, he argued that dual predestination, so predestination both to heaven and also to hell, could be, I mean, he based his views on quoting Augustine. So you can take different things from Augustine because it's a large output. And if you want to, again, if you want to pick out elements and read them in your own way, you can defend different positions. So I'm not an expert on what is held there in what is now held from the Council of Carthage. But I think it comes down to, Augustine himself said that grace and predestination were to the effect, the preparation and the effect of the same phenomenon. And he interpreted predestination as preordainment.
And that really is Augustine's Trinity, really. It's the trifecta. It's these three fundamental tenets that he is holding and trying to defend and push forward. Was there anything stated in the surviving manuscripts that would explain clearly what Augustine's motives were in bringing these? I mean, what did he say? So we can infer. I'm very much in the corner of Pelagius the man, but I want to be fair to Augustine as well, because they were just men of their time. Was there anything, without trying to read ill intent, which for me it's a little hard. I confess my bias. Is there anything stated by Augustine where he is saying this is the reason why I'm bringing it forward?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, it's when you talk about ill intent, this is not ill intent on Augustine's part. I mean, I know at the time there's lots of text at the time that suggest it was ill intent, but it's in my view, it's clearly not. If you read him, he honestly believes this is, and he says later on that God inspired him to understand the Pauline epistles in this new way. He says in a letter when someone's clearly said to him, why do you say one thing in De Libero, or in his book on free will, and why have you now change your position? He says, I write while I develop, and I develop while I write. That's an absolutely honest, legitimate position. Everybody does that. You know, that nobody is suggesting, and this is heartfelt from Augustine. He believes that this is the right way to understand it. It's the only way to understand it. Now, he himself says this is correct. His motive is that this is he suddenly had this blinding vision. I have to say here, I'm not an expert. Clearly, I'm not an expert on Augustine. That's not what I do. I've read the Pelagius and I've looked at the manuscripts, and I've therefore looked at a lot of Augustine, but I'm not a scholar of Augustine. So I am an inexpert talking about it. But scholars have said that it's right when he's writing ad simplicianum to Simplicianus, and he's looking again at the Pauline epistles, that he makes this sudden insight, and it completely changes his understanding of what Paul was saying. So it's an absolutely genuine a genuine belief that this is the right understanding of man's relationship with God. So
it may not be a necessarily valid belief, but it is a genuine one.
I think
it's valid could be up for debate.
Absolutely, but I think you also have to look at the fact that when you're what happens to Augustine is he then gets involved in a polemical situation. So if you read something like his sermon 348a, he is, on the one hand, he's constructing this caricature, this villain, but then he also says, and of course we have free will as well, but when you're because he's gone into a polemical situation and he's created this binary, he then is slightly pushed into one side of that boundary. And scholars express it differently. Some of them say he developed his ideas during the controversy. Some of them say he was pushed by the controversy towards a more extreme statement. Certainly there's a difference across his career, and we can see him in certain letters. So 348a, you can see him readjusting how he expresses his position. Letter 188 to Juliana, you can see that writing to Juliana, he is much softer and he talks about help and cooperation, where elsewhere, letter 194 to Sixtus. So Sixtus is someone who has been clearly preaching and has supported Pelagius in Rome. Is well known for doing that, and Augustine writes to him, and essentially, clearly there's some lobbying that's been going on. And Augustine then, for whatever reason, Sixtus makes a public renunciation in Rome, and then Augustine writes to him 194. And letter 194 is a very, very strong statement of absolute account of prevenient grace. But elsewhere, there are much less strong statements, and there are statements where it is a question of cooperation and help. But then other times he uses the verb agere, which is I drive, and he uses a passive. So it's being driven by God, by God's grace. So, and some would say that in his 4 last works, when the monks of Hadramautum in Africa have problems with his letter 194 specifically, they say, well, it's problematic for them, and they complain. It gets to Augustine that the abbot of Hadramautum writes to Augustine and says they're very upset by your letter 194 to Sixtus. And in response, and also in response to a letter from another layman called Hilary, this time from Gaul, and to Prosper of Aquitaine, who talked to Augustine and say, this is getting, people don't understand they don't understand this. They don't, particularly it was predestination interpreted as preordainment that was problematical. So Augustine writes 4 last works. And there again, he makes a very strong statements on the gift of perseverance and on the predestination of the saints. And he makes a very strong statement of predestination interpreted as preordainment. If you are not one of the elect, if you're not preordained to heaven, you will not get there. And that's just a truth, and you have to live with it. Whereas in southern Gaul, what upset them was that what they needed to retain was universality. So it was the universality of God's gift that really mattered to them, and they couldn't accept predestination interpreted as preordainment because they felt it demotivated it was demotivating, but it was the universality of God's love that they felt had to be preserved, and that they felt was threatened by predestination interpreted as preordainment, because
And
they
that's
couldn't preach
battle is
that.
still going on today. It's a battle of ideologies that we still see being discussed and hammered out, and some people are a little more impassioned and a little more skilled at rhetoric, but we see this battle still being played out today. So it's really fascinating to see how it's carried forward. Now, I believe Augustine even wrote that he wasn't so much concerned with even if Pelagius himself believed these 14 points, but for him, the greater issue was that this heresy be condemned, not necessarily with whether or not individual men actually affirmed it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Thank you for raising it, Warren. He did actually 4 times say in writing. Once was just about Caelestis, but the others were about Pelagius and Caelestius. He said, I think the one that really sticks in my mind is letter 179, which is to Bishop John of Jerusalem in 416. And at the end of the letter, he says, I don't much care whether Pelagius has ever held these views, or whether he at some time turns away from them. And then he signs off the letter. And I think, he's very clear, Augustine. He does write, what matters is not whether Caelestis or Pelagius has ever said these things. What matters is that this is now a recognized heresy and that these bad ideas have been condemned. Yeah, but you made the point, Warren, that these are entailments read into what they had said. And of course, what happens is that they are then, if you say that these ideas are heresy, you are then installing original sin and an absolutist account of prevenient. So you're shutting down debate. You're shutting down the range of things that grace might mean. You're shutting down debate. Had there been a synod, there probably, the history is that if there had been a synod, it would have been a fudge, and there wouldn't have been legislated on. And I say that's because in the Carolingian era, when there was the Carolingian bishop, the episcopacy was torn apart by these same issues, they resolved it with a fudge. And that, essentially what you're saying is, it's not something we can legislate on. It just, and I think that's reading John Cassian's Conference 13. His argument is we can't understand this. We can see it. Now, you could say he says both of these things are at play. We know that God's grace inspires us. We might even think it always inspires us, but we know also that the Bible tells us that there is some element of autonomy. There is some element of free will, and we just have to accept both of these things are happening, and we can't understand quite how it works, but we know that these things, and he goes through a lot of citations, as all these authors do, very carefully to say we can see both these things in action. Had there been a synod, my guess is they would have come out with a fudge. And people, I think it would have been perhaps helpful if it hadn't been legislated on. But be clear about this. In 531, Pope Boniface, I think it was, wrote to Caesarius of Arles, and he did say emphatically that predestination and original sin and prevenient grace were official church policy. So and that Caesarius of Arles put that letter in the dossier of documents from the Second Council of Orange, which had originally been held in 529, and so there are rulings that so it. Whether or not it was officially legislated on, I suspect actually that papal letter from 531 it does suggest it was legislated on, and it's just supposition as to whether or not it would have been better if it hadn't been legislated on. And
it sets all of this in motion, because as this is one determination is made, then you see now the church is really kind of forced into do we maintain that view or do we reconsider our position? And the church doesn't have the greatest history with reconsidering its position. It does on occasion, but they're pretty much locked in a direction. And so you can kind of see how it builds, and one proclamation of an emphatic interpretation then begets a whole other series of problems that later on need to be addressed. And it's fascinating to kind of take that ball of yarn and try and untangle it and lay it all out and make sense of it. And so this is something that I thoroughly enjoy. Now, in your research to the matter of Pelagius and Pelagianism, what would you say was the biggest surprise or revelation, something that you just were I don't want to say shocked, or what was the one thing that you came across and you said, oh wow, that's something I hadn't considered, or something I hadn't thought of, or what would be the biggest?
It's a really good question, but I think it's the manuscript transmission. I think it's just the sheer numbers of the manuscripts that are out there, and that the fact that that there are two completely different accounts of the anthropology and soteriology of Christianity that were there in circulation during the medieval period in manuscripts. And something that really fascinated me was the marginalia. So there were a couple of people reading them who wrote in the margins of manuscripts, as medieval readers sometimes did. We'd think it was a bad thing to do, but that they did. But the fantastic thing is it tells you what they were actually thinking. And they know, I mean, a couple of them, it's clear that they know that Pelagius is the author of his letter to Demetrias. And his letter to Demetrias is a very clear statement of the things you were talking about why free will, some element of autonomy has to be within the Christian message of salvation, and the goodness of human nature. So they know it's by Pelagius, but they go to great lengths to say, no, this is by Jerome, because Jerome is still respectable. So if Jerome said it, now of course Jerome did say it, so you can see why they could reasonably attribute it to Jerome, because Jerome also wrote a letter to Demetrias, and oddly, it's very similar to Pelagius, and it doesn't, it too could be said to at least endorse the principle. And Jerome's rest of his output is massively, endorses effective dual free will comprehensively. So you can see why they would attribute it to Jerome. But I think it's those marginalia where people are thinking about it. They've read Augustine. They've read Augustine quoting this actual letter. So they know that this letter was attributed to Pelagius by Augustine. They know what Pelagius was accused of, but they go to great lengths to say, no, this is actually by Jerome, and therefore it's acceptable. And this is the view of the Catholic Church. So they're working hard to make it acceptable. And that's in the 12th century. And that I didn't, well, something I find interesting is that there's a marginal comment in a copy of the Pauline epistles from Old Sarum, which was the precursor to Salisbury Cathedral. And they look at someone, apparently, I haven't actually seen this myself, but they commented, Jerome disagrees with Augustine. So people have known about this and they've commented on it all the way through, but they've seen that that Jerome did have one view and then he changed his position, but they haven't put two and two together. And it was pointed out to me that actually people didn't read the Greek fathers, really. They didn't read the original Greek until the 18th century or late 17th. And so Martin Luther says that Jerome is a heretic. He says Jerome is considered a father of the church, but he shouldn't be. He was, in fact, a heretic. So Luther could see that Augustine and Jerome were fundamentally opposed. But Luther didn't read the Greek. So if you'd read the Basil and the Athanasius and the Gregory of Nazianzus and all of those Greek authors, you might understand that Pelagius could never be said to have said anything new. What he did was defend two ideas that were absolutely mainstream at the time. That's the goodness of human nature and some element of autonomy. And by that, I mean, when I use the phrase effective free will, what I mean is some element of autonomy, free will to good as well as evil. But so I think that's what surprised me, is that people have known about this, that you get these little indications that people have spotted that there's a problem. Jean Garnier looked at all the manuscripts of Pelagius' statement of faith. And Jean Garnier wrote 7 treatises on Pelagianism. And he knew an awful lot about it. And he was the reason he knew so much about it is because he read manuscripts. So this is, and he said it's amazing that all these copies that people haven't spotted, that these are all by Pelagius, that they're everywhere. And Pelagius' statement of faith is everywhere. I mean, if you talk about more than 200 or 250 medieval manuscripts surviving now, that's a lot. That is a very, now, to get it in perspective, that is an awful lot. I think the top number is that Augustine's, so after liturgical books or copies of the Bible, if we're talking about, so those are by far and away the most copies that we have from the medieval period. But if you're talking about secondary patristic literature, which is the next category down, you've got Augustine's City of God is at the top. And then you're down, that's 313, I think, across Europe that have currently been identified. And then you're coming down to more, it's about, well, I think it's more than 250. Nobody's counted them because there are so many. That's one of the problems is, and that's Pelagius's, and it's traveling as Jerome, or it's traveling as, in some cases, the canons of the Council of Nicaea. So it's traveling as the output of one of the ecumenical councils that is a foundation for the church.
I find that absolutely hysterical. It's fascinating, but it is for those that, you know, that really take this Pelagius was a heretic view, to then realize that many of the documents that they're basing their beliefs on, believing it was the output of Nicaea, are actually reading Pelagius's works. That's
well, I think that's probably the medievals. I think this is the medieval period where people didn't know, but it's just I don't think people think that now, because now we know exactly what was said.
It's such a wonderful.
Yeah, but it is like incongruous. Yeah, it's ironic. Yeah, absolutely, hugely ironic. That's that. So I think it's that it's the manuscript transmission pattern that is deeply ironic. And of course, the other thing is that if there is no external source that identifies, so if you haven't got a Rosius or Augustine or Jerome quoting from it and saying, this is Pelagius, this is bad, Pelagius's writings pass without comment. There are no marginal comments saying, warning, this is heresy, unless somebody else has quoted it. So where it's not identified as by Pelagius in an external source, nobody notices there's anything wrong with it. And that's another striking feature of the manuscript transmission. That's
fantastic. Yeah, I'm gonna be playing this interview back, I think, a few times, just soaking all this in. We have a question here from David. He asks, what were the long-lasting effects of Pelagius in Britain?
That's a really, really, well, that's an area of my research. I mean, I think that's a really fascinating question. I would argue that this is, in all of our hagiography, all of our texts, you can see people still really, really concerned about this issue. And I would argue that someone like Gildas, who's writing in around 540, so to say what's the lasting effects, the effect is it absolutely contorts. It is a subject of conversation. It's being discussed in the texts that survive. Later on, it becomes something that Bede, an Anglo Saxon monk, uses. He equates a different dating of Easter, a different system for dating Easter, with Pelagianism. So the long-lasting effect there is that he manages to say that if you use a different dating system for calculating the date of when Easter should fall, you are a Pelagian. Now it's not legitimate. It's not a legitimate equation at all. There's nothing. Right. One is a question of practice, and another is a question of doctrine. And also, he has this fictional notion of Pelagianism where it's, you know, one end of a binary extreme, and it's not about cooperation at all. So it's a fiction anyway. So the long-lasting effects are actually, you could see it contorting. It's there being discussed in texts. It crops up in hagiography as a caricature villain. So you'll sometimes see in the life of David, there's a Welsh saint, as in David, St David of patron saint of Wales. You'll see that suddenly there's a synod and it's condemning Pelagianism, and David is hailed for condemning it. But that's because that's the caricature. So you are seen as, you know, it's being used in that way. There's a papal letter around 640 writing to the bishops of Ireland that Bede records, where it talks about, it threatens them. It says, we've heard that Pelagianism is resurrected in Ireland. And so it's the threat of, it becomes a weapon. Essentially, a heresy accusation weaponizes doctrine. It
really has taken on a life of being a boogeyman. Yes. You know, the monster that lurks under the bed to some extent, you know, that we all should fear and be afraid of. It seems to have taken on that sort of life of its own, really.
That's what I think. So once you have a weapon lying there, of course anybody can pick it up, and of course it's conveniently empty of actual content because it becomes just an accusation of arrogance. And so it can be used against a random range of people have had this, been beaten over the head with this stick. The early Quakers were accused of Pelagianism. There's no link. You can manufacture a link if you want to, because you can accuse someone of arrogance. That's an easy, of not needing God, essentially, of being an enemy of grace means that you're an enemy of God. You don't need God. You're arrogant and you think you're self-sufficient. And of course that's handy, that's convenient. A lot of you can make that into an accusation against someone that you don't approve of. So I think that once the weapon is there lying around, anybody can pick it up. And that, I think there are some extraordinary texts. When you talk about it being a bogeyman, yes, absolutely. And people internalize that, and it becomes about what they fear in themselves. So they're afraid of themselves. So 14th century Oxford becomes an issue again. The followers of Occam want to reintroduce some ideas to do with free will and to do with being more in control, that man is not totally evil and that we do have some element of free will. And Bradwardine, another scholar in Oxford, reacts against this very, very strongly. And in his tome on the subject, in which he condemns contemporary lecturers for being, as he calls them, Pelagians, he has a nightmare. He describes a nightmare where he has fought a hand-to-hand battle, falling down from heaven. He's in the sky and he's fighting Pelagius. And I'm not convinced that it's completely a fiction for this book. I mean, I think he may actually, the way he describes it, it's almost as if he actually genuinely has had a nightmare. I don't know if I'm being naive, but he definitely has internalized that struggle. It has become something he's really frightened of. He's clearly very worried about the way that lecturers at the university are going, that this is really bad for humanity. And it reads like he's afraid of it in himself. And it is a bogeyman. It's a caricature villain. And he fights with it hand to hand with knives and stabs it. It's like fighting with the devil. It has become a form of demon or devil. So yes, it did become a bogeyman.
That's fascinating. And we have a question here from Jack. I believe he purchased your book recently, thanks to our endorsement here on Idol Killer. He said, if you get a chance, can you mention that the quotes in the book are excellent? Could you ask how someone would go about defending the quotes in the book if challenged? He says he's on page 166.
Well, defending them if challenged. I guess it depends which quotes you're talking about. So I was focusing on a very restricted set of things I was trying to show. So I was trying to show Pelagius didn't say anything new. So that's just putting forward quotes that show that this is not new. It's not a new terminology. It's simply been said before by all these people and for a long time. So those quotes, I think it's relatively easy to defend. But of course, you could pick out other bits of Athanasius and say, oh, but he says something else. So it's actually very difficult to defend absolutely everything. And certainly with Augustine, you can certainly, I pick out certain quotes. It goes without saying that you can go into the body of Augustine and find other works where he will say other things, and you could defend it and attack those and say, oh, well, that's not the full picture on Augustine. You need to look at where he talks elsewhere about something else. That's absolutely true. So
in regards to that, are you familiar with Dr. Ken Wilson's research on the chronological work of Augustine's writings and how he documented a shift from essentially a Pelagius affirmation of free will and man's innate ability to do good, and he evolved slowly over time, likely as a result of, in part due to his conflict with Pelagius, into more of that deterministic trifecta. Are you familiar with his work on that?
Yeah, I have met Ken and I have heard him speak about it. Yes, absolutely. And I do know, and yes, that argument is something that scholars have, you can make that case because it's so clear in the in Augustine's earlier works. I mean, he starts off as a Neoplatonist, in his early works. He is developing, but There's nothing wrong with developing. And, Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that Lutheranism, if it didn't keep changing, if it didn't keep reforming, it was a continuous process of reform. So the bigger issue is, should doctrine stay static, or should ideas develop? And that's the bigger issue. And there's nothing wrong with developing issue. John Henderson, I thought his argument about actually this is how religions work, and he looked at Confucianism and early Judaism, and he looked at other religions and said, actually, this is the common process. I think he said the genius of neo-orthodoxy is that it disguises its newness, and that's why its newness passes unnoticed. That's what it does. It always presents itself as the old, and it presents the opposite. It presents mainstream as something new and dangerous, and that's a strategy, and that's how religions change their doctrine. Is it wrong for religion? No, maybe it's definitely perhaps not. I mean, that's a whole question about tradition versus innovation, but I was to me, I thought Bonhoeffer had a point when he talked about it's either a constant process of reform, or it's not what he knew as Lutheranism. So he thought that was a valuable process.
It seems too that each generation, and we recently had a guest on where we were talking about the need for each generation to not simply stand on the conclusions that others of their forebears had made, but to personally get in and mix it up, as it were, and think through those things for themselves. And so that's, I think, where that idea of constant reformation, and that's because we, like Augustine, are constantly growing and learning and changing as people in our understanding and our perspective. And so it's a very fascinating point. I do believe, let's see, where did it go? I'm so sorry here. I had this pulled up. We do have another fan in the house. Doug says you're a powerhouse.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
Let's see. Here we go. Would Ambrose have supported Augustine or Pelagius, Julian, or both overall? Do you have any comment to that?
Yeah, well, Jeffrey, that's a really interesting question. And the person the thing I read that most interested me and influenced me on that would be Rowan Greer's book, Fear of Freedom, because actually I wish I'd read it a long time ago, but actually way before, in 1989, it was published, and he did an analysis of Ambrose. And so Rowan Greer is a truly phenomenal scholar, way, way more scholarly than me, had a breadth of understanding, which really extraordinary, Yale professor. And I couldn't even remotely be in the same league as him. It's extraordinary. And he wrote a book, Fear of Freedom, published 1989. And he looked at Ambrose, and when you read the reviews of the book, quite a few people didn't seem to understand it. They didn't understand what he was trying to do. He was doing several things at once. And they just said, oh, he's talking about holy men, but Peter Brown's said everything he was to say about her. What's he doing? But essentially, he looked at Ambrose in particular, and he identified what he called the Christianized version of the Platonic pursuit of virtue. So he said the 4th century mainstream Christianity, and he was Rowan Greer was a real expert in Christianity, Theodore Mopsuestia, but also the Greek fathers. So he said, actually, this is a Christianized form of the Platonic pursuit of individual. It's an individual pursuit of virtue. And he regarded Augustine's theology as new, and as a new theology that really changed that. And he used Ambrose. He looked at Ambrose in depth and quoted lots of text and said, we could see that this is the individualistic approach to Christianity. This is an individual's pursuit of virtue. Now, I hadn't looked at Ambrose, and so when I read it was a whole new a whole new perspective. And Greer was doing, I think, some other things that were really, really interesting. So the answer to your question is no. If you read Rowan Greer, he's absolutely, the point of his book, or one of the points of his book, is that Ambrose was for that individualistic pursuit of virtue, the Basil of Caesarea, the Athanasius, and that this is what gets overturned by Augustine. And Greer identified 3 changes. One, so Greer had this huge, phenomenal scholarship. He had this perspective which included ancient Greece, and he was responding to a book by Dodds called The Greeks and the Irrational. And he said there are 3 things going on. He said, I don't know what the causal relationship going on here is, but I can see 3 things happening in this new theology, in this shift. One of them is that the irrational is being privileged over the rational. Another one is that the power of God is being privileged over the freedom of the individual. And the other one is that the community is being privileged over the individual. And he didn't quite know, he said, I don't know causally, I don't think, but he said, what I can see is that Augustine's new theology better reflects that new stress on community and that reducing of the individual. He said, I can see these shifts happening in this theology. I don't know why, but I do think that Augustine's theology fits in better with this new stress on the community. And that's where the holy men and the saints in the communities, as defender of communities, that's why he was talking about holy men. But Greer also did something which was really interesting, which was that he said that this failure that had been identified by Dodds of the Greeks in classical Athens to what Greer described as jump the fence to serious, complete, a rational community where everyone is free. He used the analogy of a horse that is balking, the shying at a fence, and said they failed it then. And he implied that they failed it again when they adopted Augustine's new theology. So they rode back on what he said was, this is the mainstream 4th century individualistic pursuit of virtue. Again, they failed to jump. And he said, in our own day, are we going to, he said, he seemed to think this was a looming choice that was coming to face us. And he thought that somehow communication, I think I'm right, I mean, you need to read the book for yourself. I hope I'm not mis-explaining it.
This ties in perfectly with the question, because, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it was just that I think what Greer suggested was that we might fail it. He was asking the question, are we, for a third time, going to fail to jump this fence? Are we going to shy away from freedom? Sorry.
No, I'm glad you made that point. I didn't mean to cut you off. Jack asks where we should go next if we want to know more after the myth of Pelagianism. He said he's also purchased Ken Wilson's full book. But this book by Greer, could you give the author's full name and title again? I think that would be a great resource.
Yeah, he's Rowan Greer, Greer, and he was professor at Yale, and it's called just Fear of Freedom. It was published in 1989. I found it interesting.
Oh my gosh, The Fear of Freedom. I mean, what a wonderful title. It immediately grabs me and puts its hooks into me. So that'll be next on my my Amazon purchase if I can find a copy. Let's see. I'm going to scroll through here real quickly here.
In answer to the question of where to go next, I think the Rowan Greer, but also just reading the texts. You know, I actually just think just getting hold of Brindley Rees produced an edition of translations of many of the letters that Pelagius wrote, and others that I don't think Pelagius did write, but and some of these anonymous ascetic texts that are circulating around the Mediterranean with all this fervor and enthusiasm for asceticism. I think just read the texts. That's the next thing to do, because I think that what has bedeviled this is that people have either been experts in Augustine or they've known a bit about Pelagius. But if you look at, when I was looking, what I moved on to is, why has nobody pointed this out before? Because that's the obvious thing. You say 1600 years, how come nobody said this before? And then I found that what happened is that Pelagius wasn't really, he wasn't discovered until the 20th century. So his works were traveling under false attributions. 20th century, people suddenly said, hang on a minute, they identified things as by Pelagius. So he was rediscovered in his own words. And I think Brindley Rees's book makes that accessible to people in translation. So I think to go back to the actual Pelagius, because so many people haven't read Pelagius.
No,
they haven't read it for themselves.
In the religious community, there's a fear of reading those works by authors that have that stigma over them.
That's a very good point. Of course,
to the dark side, you know, it's
totally.
Fear. Yeah,
that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that, because I just think of them as historical texts, you know. But yes, absolutely, I can see that completely.
And I think that's tremendous advice. Just go to the text and engage with the text as it's written. Try to understand the context, the culture, and the author's intent by using critical reading, and make up our own determinations based off of that. I think that's great. Jordan says this is a really interesting interview. He says, thanks for doing this, and thanks to Dr. Bonner. I know this is going to be a video that many of us listen to again and again here. Again, just some nice affirmation here. People are really enjoying this. Thank you, Dr. Bonner. Super full of insights, and your delivery is excellent. Thank you again. Oh, no, this is a privilege for me to have. Yes, ma'am. Let's see. And then Jeffrey says, I am getting the book. I've heard of Greer before through quotations and other sources. So yeah, I think they may beat me to Amazon. So I think by the time I'm here, all of the available copies will have collected. So I'll be last to get one, but I will add it to my library as well. Allie, is there anything else that you'd like to speak to that you haven't addressed yet? Is there any point that you just really want to maybe highlight or circle back around to?
I don't think so. I think it's just to understand. Well, I suppose the one thing that struck me, actually, when you asked about something surprising, when I was reading, we haven't talked about Julian of Eclanum, and I'm not I have read quite a bit, but I'm not such an expert. But there is one point where he talks about, I would say this, there was a really interesting paper at the Oxford Patristics, number of versions of it many years ago, which pointed out that both Julian and Augustine in their writings back and forth, basically speaking to each other and answering each other, became very acrimonious and were really personal in their abuse that they traded. But in one of his writings, he doesn't just talk about unconditional love, but he actually describes what it feels like, and he sets it out for his readers. And he talks about not just feeling love for your family and your friends or your community, but what it feels like. He talks about the stages and how eventually you would feel love for the whole human race, and that would be what would inspire you. And I think he's trying to get people to understand what it would feel like. Now, what jumps out at you is the disparity between that and the way he was trading a bit, So what you said, Warren, about people have very strong views and they find it difficult not to impute ill will to other people. I guess that's a warning to us that, of course, people who were both inspired by Jesus actually, when they got really upset about something, would fall from those standards.
It's great to proclaim and promote.
It's one thing to
try and maintain that.
Yeah, and to read someone actually trying to describe unconditional love in a text written in the 420s, 430s, I thought was exceptional. And the other thing I would say is that in the 2019 Patristics Conference, a great scholar, Professor Wolfram Kinzig, who's an expert on creeds and has published a fantastic full volume about all the creeds, phenomenal number of different creeds in all their different formulae. It's Faith in Formulae is the title. And he gave a keynote lecture, and in it he said, he got to the end of describing the history of the creeds, and he is the expert on the creeds at this point. And he said, actually, maybe this wasn't, we should have a new perspective on this. And he said, what's missing, it's all full of doctrine, and what's missing is ethics. And I thought, to be able to stand back after those years, a lifetime of scholarship, a career of scholarship on the creeds, and say, look what's not there. And he talked about the influence of Rome on the creeds and said, but what's missing is ethics. This is all about doctrine. And he talked about how bishops were made to swear these creeds over the relics of, it became very legalistic. And that's our Christian creed, those are our Christian creeds. And they don't say anything about ethics, about how you should behave, or about Jesus's message about how you should behave.
And I think that leads to why you see sometimes these people who have affirmed these things defending them in such an unloving and sometimes dishonest manner, because for them it's more a commitment to the ideology than the practice. And so
I agree. It's just, I totally agree. But the problem is, of course, it's difficult.
It is.
And there we come back to the Julian of Eclanum and the Augustine, two men who are absolutely profoundly engaged with Jesus. I mean, there is no doubt they are trying to be as Christian as they can be. They're profoundly engaged with it, and yet they feel so strongly about it that they're impolite to each other. So I just think that's, you have to understand, and that's why I think your view, Warren, of being able to understand that people have good intentions, but that we disagree, and we need to be able to talk about different views. That's so valuable.
Civility, empathy, kindness, charity, they're lofty ideals, but whether you're in the religious, the secular, I'm sure the scholastic, sometimes you find that you get sparks when people disagree. One other question here from Scott. He asks if Pelagius was condemned because of one belief that the Pope didn't like, and therefore everything lumped in with the 14, or whether they disagreed with all of the 14 charges that comprised.
Oh, the African Church, the Concilia anathemata, so the statements that were said to be right, these are anathemata, these are heresy, you cannot, those statements, it was all 14, it wasn't just one. The confusion, it's a really good question, because I may have confused people. In Honorius's rescript, only one thing is mentioned, and that's original sin. But you're quite right, it's a good point, I hadn't thought of that, but there are two different legislative actions are going on here. One is the Church Council from Africa that's passing, the Carthage passing these anathemata, these concilia decisions, and it's saying these statements are heresy. But the other thing is Honorius the Emperor issuing an imperial rescript, and the only doctrinal issue that he mentions in that is original sin.
Mm.
So both is the answer. It's a really good question, and the answer is both.
That's fascinating. Thank you for the question, Scott.
We don't have Zosimus. I mean, the answer, Scott, also is we don't have Zosimus's letter. Zosimus's letter, where he did condemn, where he did he excommunicated Pelagius, doesn't survive in full. So, and again, it's the caricature that seems in the fragments that have been put together by Otto Vermelinger. It looks as if it's the caricature that's being condemned.
And then we have one other question here. What was the author of The Fear of Freedom? That was Mr. Greer?
Yeah, Rowan Greer.
Rowan Greer. And we'll put the link to Dr. Bonner's book. We'll put the link to Mr. Greer's book in the show notes here. So within about 15 minutes, all of that will be available. So if anybody has any more questions, again, this is what the copy that I picked up looks like. It is not an inexpensive, but it is certainly well worth the money read, and all of that will be available for everyone. Dr. Bonner, do you have any last parting words?
No, thank you for having me, and thank you for it's been really fascinating, and thank you to all the viewers and for their questions. But thank you.
It was a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. You'll have to come back in and give us a refresher, perhaps in some time. But thank you so much, Dr. Bonner. And again, if anyone is interested in this, all of the information will be in the description, the show notes. We'll have all of that up and running for you in about 15 minutes or so after this episode ends. But in the meantime, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, this has been Discussing the Myth of Pelagianism with Dr. Ali Bonner. You've been watching Idol Killer. We love you guys. God bless and take care.
Bye.